The scent of gardenias and stale beer clung to the air, a sickening perfume in what was supposed to be the sanctity of her home. Maribel, usually meticulous, had left her favorite emerald scarf draped over the armchair, a flash of color in the otherwise muted hallway. She'd rushed home, heart pounding with an unusual apprehension, a text from her sister, Calla, simply reading, "Call me now," ringing in her ears. The front door had been unlocked, a small detail that now felt like a blaring siren. A low murmur, not the television, but something more intimate, drew her towards their bedroom, each step a leaden weight. Her hand trembled on the doorknob. The soft light spilling from the crack underneath was deceptive, a false calm before a storm. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The sight that greeted her stole the air from her lungs, freezing time and sound. There, in their bed, under the quilt her grandmother had hand-stitched, lay her husband, Lowell, entangled with another woman. The shock was a physical blow, a cold wave that washed over her, chilling her to the bone. It wasn't just any woman. It was Trina, her best friend since kindergarten, the one who knew her deepest secrets, her greatest fears, her most cherished dreams. Trina, with her bright, infectious laugh and the subtle mole above her lip that Maribel had always found endearing. A strangled gasp escaped Maribel's throat, a sound so raw and pained it barely registered as her own. Lowell's eyes, glazed with something akin to guilt and surprise, snapped open. Trina, startled, scrambled to pull the sheet higher, her face a mask of shame and defiance. "Maribel! It's not what it looks like." The words were a flimsy shield, shattering against the brutal reality. Maribel's vision blurred, tears welling up, hot and stinging. Her world, meticulously built over years of shared laughter and quiet dreams, crumbled in that single, horrifying instant. The room began to spin, the air thick and suffocating. Lowell finally moved, reaching for her, a pathetic, desperate gesture. "Maribel, please, let me explain." His voice was a betrayal, resonating with a hollowness that echoed in her soul. She recoiled, her heart a raw, bleeding wound. The gardenia scent now felt like a mockery, a reminder of the innocent hopes she'd harbored just hours ago. She wanted to scream, to smash something, anything, to make the unbearable pain subside. But no sound came. Only a low, guttural growl vibrated in her chest. She stared at them, truly saw them, their bodies intertwined, their faces etched with a sickening mix of fear and remorse. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical tearing within her. How long had this been going on? How many times had Trina sat across from her, sharing coffee, knowing the secret? The questions swirled, a venomous current. Her gaze landed on the framed wedding photo on the nightstand, their smiling faces, full of hope, ignorant of the serpent in their garden. She snatched it, her fingers tightening around the silver frame. With a surge of unexpected strength, she hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, echoing the shards of her broken heart. Lowell flinched, but Maribel barely noticed. Her focus was solely on Trina. A dangerous calm settled over Maribel, a terrifying stillness in the eye of her personal hurricane. She pointed a trembling finger at her friend, her voice, when it finally came, a low, dangerous whisper. "Get out. Both of you. Now." Trina hesitated, then slowly began to gather her clothes from the floor, avoiding Maribel's gaze. Lowell, pale and shaken, started to rise. Maribel's eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now cold, hard chips of ice, reflecting only desolate pain. Trina fled, her footsteps a rapid, shameful patter down the stairs. The front door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence. Maribel and Lowell were alone, the space between them filled with the wreckage of their marriage. "Maribel," he started, his voice cracking, pulling a pair of boxers on. I don't know what to say. It happened. It just happened?" Maribel's voice was lethal. "In our bed? With my best friend?" She advanced on him, her pain twisting into a white-hot rage. "How long, Lowell? How long have you been laughing at me? Lowell, usually so confident, so in control, looked small and weak. He backed away from her, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "Maribel, please, you're upset. Just let me." He continued to backpedal out of the bedroom, moving into the dimly lit landing at the top of the main staircase. "It meant nothing. I swear," he pleaded. But Maribel was past hearing. Her world had ended, and the man who had ended it was still talking. "Nothing?" Maribel's voice cracked, echoing in the narrow hallway. "You call this nothing?" She pointed back at the rumpled sheets, the physical evidence of his betrayal. "You brought her into our home. The home our children sleep in. You looked me in the eye this morning and said you loved me. Was that nothing, too?" Each word was a dagger, and Lowell flinched, his face ashen. He was cornered, his back nearly to the railing of the staircase that dropped 2 stories to the hardwood floor below. "Maribel, you don't understand," Lowell stammered, his eyes wide with a mix of shame and a new, rising fear. He wasn't just afraid of her anger anymore, he was afraid of her. The look in her eyes was one he had never seen, a profound, bottomless emptiness that terrified him. He took another step back, his hand fumbling for the wooden newel post. "It wasn't. I wasn't. I was going to end it." "Liar," she screamed. The word ripped from her throat, raw and agonizing. It was the final straw, the one word that encapsulated the entire, sickening situation. In that moment, Maribel took a step towards him, her hand raised, not to strike, but in a gesture of pure, desperate anguish. It was an accusation, a final plea for a truth he was incapable of giving. Lowell saw her move. In his panic, he reacted. He recoiled violently, twisting his body away from her. His foot, however, found no purchase. It slipped on the edge of the landing's rug. His arms pinwheeled, grasping at empty air. His other foot lifted, and for a heart-stopping second, he was suspended in a terrible, unnatural balance. Time seemed to slow. Maribel's scream died in her throat, her anger vanishing, replaced by a sudden, icy horror. "Lowell," she shrieked, lunging forward, her hand outstretched. But she was too late. His eyes met hers, wide with terror and disbelief. Then, he was gone. He pitched backward, over the railing, into the dark void of the stairwell. There was no sound at first, just the awful, silent drop. It was followed by a series of sickening, percussive sounds, a heavy thud against the wall, a crack of wood, and finally, a devastating, final crash as his body met the hardwood floor at the bottom. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more terrifying than any sound Maribel had ever heard. The house, their home, seemed to hold its breath. Maribel crept forward, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the railing to stand. She peered over the edge, down into the darkness of the foyer below. He was a crumpled shape, a pile of limbs twisted at an unnatural angle. He wasn't moving. He wasn't moving at all. "Lowell," she whispered, her voice a small, trembling thing. No answer. "Lowell," she tried again, louder this time, her voice cracking with a new, frantic terror that eclipsed the betrayal. "Oh God, Lowell! Get up!" He lay perfectly still. A dark, glistening pool was beginning to spread slowly on the polished wood from beneath his head. Maribel's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. The rage was gone, the heartbreak was gone. All that was left was a cold, paralyzing dread. The man who had shattered her life was now lying broken at the bottom of their stairs. And she was the only one there. Her mind flashed. Did I push him? Did I? She couldn't remember. She couldn't breathe. Her trembling fingers fumbled in her pocket for her phone, her eyes never leaving the still, dark shape below. The next hour was a blur of noise and flashing lights, a stark contrast to the deathly silence that had followed Lowell's fall. Maribel's 911 call was a series of choked sobs and half-formed words. "He fell, my husband, he's not moving, Please, hurry. I think he's. She couldn't say the word. Paramedics had arrived with a speed that felt both instantaneous and agonizingly slow. They had moved with a practiced, detached efficiency, strapping Lowell to a backboard, his head immobilized, his face a waxy, unrecognizable mask. Now, she sat in the hard plastic chair of the hospital waiting room. The air smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. She was still wearing her work coat, the emerald scarf clutched in her fist. She hadn't cried. She hadn't spoken. She just sat, staring at a flickering television screen showing a silent game show. Her mind was a blank, static-filled screen, unable to process the betrayal or the fall. The two events were too monstrous, too close, and had cancelled each other out, leaving her in a numb, hollow void. A police officer had spoken to her, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened? Did you see him fall?" Maribel had just stared at him. We were arguing," she'd whispered, the words tasting like ash. I don't know." I turned, and he was just backing up. He tripped. The officer nodded, his eyes sympathetic but searching. "We're going to need a formal statement later." She nodded, her gaze drifting back to the swinging doors of the emergency room. Time stretched. 1 hour became 2. Finally, a doctor in blue scrubs, his face etched with fatigue, pushed through the doors and called her name. "Mrs. Rivington?" Maribel stood, her legs feeling like concrete. He led her to a small, private alcove. "Your husband is alive," the doctor said, and Maribel felt a rush of something. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was just an acknowledgement. "He has a severe spinal cord injury," the doctor continued, his voice low. "Specifically, a fracture at the C5 and C6 vertebrae." He spoke of swelling, of paralysis, of prognosis. The words washed over Maribel, technical and cold. "What are you saying?" she finally interrupted, her voice hoarse. The doctor's eyes softened. "I'm saying his fall has resulted in quadriplegia. He has some movement in his shoulders and biceps, but as of right now, he has no feeling or movement from the chest down. Including his hands." Maribel leaned against the wall, the blood draining from her face. No movement. No feeling. The man who had held her, who had betrayed her with those same hands, could no longer use them. Will he ever walk again?" she whispered. The doctor sighed, a sound of practiced caution. "The swelling is significant. We need to wait for it to go down to know the full extent of the damage. But it is very unlikely. You need to prepare yourself for that." He told her Lowell was being moved to the ICU. He was stabilized, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "He's conscious, but heavily medicated." He led her through another set of doors, into a world of beeping machines and hushed voices. There, in a room filled with blinking lights, lay Lowell. He was in a halo brace, a rigid metal ring bolted to his skull to keep his head and neck perfectly still. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. They flickered towards her as she entered. A tear traced a path from the corner of his eye into his hairline. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked helpless, terrified, and utterly broken. The man who had destroyed her world was now trapped inside his own body. And as she looked at him, Maribel felt the first, terrible flicker of a feeling she couldn't name: responsibility. Maribel stood at the foot of the hospital bed, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. Lowell's eyes, wide and frantic, were locked on her. The halo brace made him look like a captured king, stripped of all power and dignity. His face was a pale, sweat-streaked mask of pain and fear. The man who had stood over her in their bedroom, so full of deceit, was gone. In his place was a broken, trapped creature, and he was still her husband. She pulled a chair to his bedside, her movements stiff. She sat, but didn't reach for him. She simply watched him, her mind a turbulent storm of conflicting emotions. She felt the raw, searing anger of his betrayal battling with the horrifying, immediate pity of his condition. It was a war inside her, and she had no idea which side would win. "Maribel," he finally whispered. His voice was a dry, rasping sound, barely audible. "Maribel. I can't." "You can't move," she finished for him, her voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "The doctor told me." Lowell's eyes squeezed shut, and fresh tears rolled down his temples. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "Maribel, I am so sorry." "For which part, Lowell?" she asked, her voice cold. "For falling? Or for what you did before you fell?" His eyes flew open, a new wave of panic flashing in them. For everything. For Trina." "Oh God, Maribel, it was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. It meant nothing." He was pleading now, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "Please, you have to believe me. It got out of control." Maribel stared at the 4-line dripping fluid into his arm. She watched the steady rhythm of his chest rising and falling, a rhythm that was now a medical miracle. "How long?" she asked, the same question she had screamed at the top of the stairs. This time, it was a quiet, dangerous demand. Lowell hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ceiling. "Lowell. How long?" "6 months," he whispered, his voice cracking. It started at the company picnic. We were talking. You were with the kids. We talked. Then it was texts. Then it was more. 6 months. Half a year." Her mind reeled, replaying every shared laugh, every family dinner, every "I love you" from the past 6 months as a grotesque lie. She felt the bile rise in her throat. All the while, he was with Trina. Her best friend. "You are a monster," she said, the words simple, factual. "I know," he sobbed, the tears coming freely now. "I know. I'm a fool. I'm a terrible. I was going to end it. I swear I was. Today. I was going to tell her it was over. I love you, Maribel. I only love you. Please, don't leave me. Not like this. Please. I have no one else." His desperation was palpable, pathetic. He was utterly at her mercy. Maribel stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. She looked down at him, this man who was her husband, her betrayer, and now, her burden. He had destroyed her past and, in one clumsy, panicked step, had chained her to his future. She felt a cold, hard decision settling in her heart, like a stone dropping into a frozen lake. She walked to the door, her back to him. "Maribel, wait. Where are you going?" "Please," he cried, his voice pitching high with terror. She paused, her hand on the door. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm going to call my sister to pick up the kids. I'm going to find your doctor. I'm going to deal with the insurance." She turned, her face a mask of cold resolve. "And then I'm going to find out what it takes to keep you alive." His face flooded with a pathetic, desperate relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Oh God, thank you." But Maribel cut him off. "Don't thank me," she said, her eyes like ice. "The woman you cheated with. Trina, she's in the waiting room. She's been here for an hour, asking for you. I'm going to go talk to her now." Maribel pushed through the ICU doors, her footsteps silent and purposeful. The main waiting room was nearly empty in the early hours of the morning, save for a few people sleeping under thin blankets. And then she saw her. Trina was huddled in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. She was wearing the same clothes she'd fled the house in, her hair a tangled mess. She looked up as Maribel approached, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified. "Maribel! Oh my God, is he okay?" Trina scrambled to her feet, her hands reaching out in a gesture of, what? Support? Pity? Maribel stared at the outstretched hands, the same hands that had been on her husband, in her bed. The image flashed in her mind, and a pure, unadulterated rage, cleaner and sharper than any emotion she'd felt all night, surged through her. Crack. The sound of Maribel's palm connecting with Trina's face echoed in the quiet room. It was not a wild swing, but a deliberate, powerful strike that snapped Trina's head to the side. Trina gasped, her hand flying to her stinging cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "Don't you ever," Maribel hissed, her voice a low, dangerous vibration, "speak his name to me again." "Maribel, I'm so sorry," Trina whimpered, tears welling. "I never meant for any of this." "You never meant to?" Maribel advanced on her, and Trina cowered back against the wall. "You never meant to sleep with my husband? You never meant to lie to my face every day for 6 months? You never meant for him to fall? What, exactly, did you mean to do, Trina?" Trina was sobbing openly now, a pathetic, broken sound. "I don't know. I don't know. I love him, Maribel. I really do." The words hung in the sterile air, a confession so audacious, so profoundly insulting, that Maribel felt the breath leave her body. "You love him," Maribel repeated, her voice deceptively calm. "You love him." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Well, that changes everything, doesn't it?" "Get out," Maribel said, her voice dropping again. "I'm warning you. Get out of this hospital." "But I need to see him," Trina cried, a note of defiance in her voice. "I have a right to." "A right?" Maribel stepped so close their faces were inches apart. "You have no rights here. You are nothing. You are the woman who broke my family. You will not see him. You will not call here. You will not come near my children. If I ever see your face again, I will call the police." Trina stared at her, her face crumbling from defiance to despair. She saw the unbending steel in Maribel's eyes. This was not the Maribel she knew, the one who baked cookies and hosted book club. This was someone new, someone forged in the fire of the last 3 hours. Trina's shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew she had lost. She fumbled for her purse, her eyes still locked on Maribel, full of hatred and fear. "You think you've won, don't you?" Trina whispered, her voice venomous. "You think you get to be the saint, the forgiving wife." Maribel said nothing, her expression unyielding. "He was going to leave you for me," Trina spat, her final, desperate blow. "He told me last night. We were making plans. He was going to tell you tonight." "That argument?" "That was him, trying to find the words to end it." "You didn't just lose a husband, Maribel. You lost a man who didn't even want you anymore." Maribel's stoic mask wavered. A flicker of pain, so profound it was physical, crossed her features. Trina saw it and smiled, a broken, ugly twitch of her lips. She had found her target. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor, leaving Maribel to stand alone in the waiting room, her world shattering for the second time in one night. The man she was now tied to, the man she had to save, hadn't even wanted her. Weeks bled into a month, a monotonous, draining cycle of beeping machines and the sterile smell of the rehab facility. Lowell had been transferred from the hospital to a specialized spinal cord injury center. The halo brace was gone, replaced by a rigid neck collar, but the diagnosis remained unchanged. He was a quadriplegic. The doctors and therapists spoke in a language Maribel now understood all too well: plateaus, muscle atrophy, adaptive equipment. His life, and hers, was now a checklist of medical procedures. Maribel was a ghost haunting the halls. She was there every day. She learned how to help the nurses turn him to prevent bedsores. She learned how to feed him, how to hold a cup with a straw to his lips. She learned how to read the monitors and understand his medication schedule. She did it all with a cold, mechanical efficiency. She was driven by a grim, joyless duty, not by love. The woman from the waiting room, the one who had slapped Trina, was gone. In her place was a tired, numb caretaker. Her sister, Calla, had become her lifeline. Calla managed the children, 7-year-old Mia and 9-year-old Jareth. She shuttled them to school, made their dinners, and deflected their confused, scared questions. Why can't Daddy come home? Why is Mommy always at the hospital? Maribel would see them in the evenings, her energy so depleted she could only offer weak smiles and empty hugs before collapsing into bed, setting her alarm for the 5 a.m. trip back to the facility. Lowell, for his part, was a model patient. He was broken, not just physically, but emotionally. The arrogance and confidence that had defined him were gone, sanded away by helplessness and shame. He did his physical therapy exercises with a desperate fervor, straining to achieve the smallest flicker of movement in his wrists. He was unfailingly polite to the nurses, and endlessly, pathetically grateful to Maribel. "Thank you, Maribel," he'd whisper when she adjusted his pillow. "You're a saint, Maribel," he'd say when she wiped his chin. Each word of gratitude felt like a small, sharp stone pelting her. She didn't want his gratitude. She wanted her life back. She wanted to scream. But she just nodded, her face blank, and checked his catheter bag. The confession from Trina, "He was going to leave you," played on a loop in her mind. She was caring for a man who had been packing his bags to abandon her. One gray Tuesday afternoon, Maribel was in the small family lounge, trying to make sense of a mountain of medical bills. The numbers were staggering, astronomical. She felt like she was drowning. Her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, a polite, professional voice on the other end. It was a case manager from their health insurance company. "Mrs. Rivington, we're calling regarding Mr. Rivington's continued inpatient stay." Maribel explained his condition, her voice weary. "Yes," the woman said. "We have the file. Unfortunately, his policy has a cap on long-term inpatient rehabilitation. That cap will be reached in 7 days." Maribel's blood ran cold. What does that mean?" "It means," the case manager said, her voice full of practiced, impersonal sympathy, "that as of next Tuesday, the insurance will no longer cover his stay at the facility. You will either need to arrange for private payment or transfer him to a state-funded nursing home. Or," she added, as if it were a simple alternative, "you can arrange for at-home care." Maribel looked at the bill in her hand, the total already in the 6-figure range. Private pay was impossible. A state home, she pictured rows of beds in a dark, smelling room. At-home care? Who would do that? The phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. They were financially ruined. The drive to the bank felt like a funeral procession. Maribel sat at a red light, the case manager's words echoing in her head. At-home care. It was the only option that wasn't a complete surrender. But it required a hospital bed, a Hoyer lift, a wheelchair, a home care nurse, all of which cost money. Money they didn't have. But they had savings. They had their rainy day fund, the one they diligently built for 10 years, the one meant for college, for retirement, for a trip to Europe. It was raining now. It was pouring. She walked into the bank, the familiar marble lobby feeling cold and imposing. She sat with a bank officer, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patel, and explained the situation. "I need to withdraw the entire balance from our joint savings account," Maribel said, her voice hollow. Mrs. Patel typed, her brow furrowing. "Mrs. Rivington, what is the balance you're expecting?" Maribel told her. "Around $90,000. Mrs. Patel's face tightened with pity. She turned the monitor to face Maribel. "Ma'am, that account was emptied 4 days ago." Maribel stared at the screen. "Current balance, $14.22. "What?" she whispered. "No. That's a mistake. Run it again. It's a joint account." "There was one withdrawal," Mrs. Patel said gently, "for $92,000. It was a wire transfer. Since Mr. Rivington is a joint owner on the account, he was authorized to make it. 4 days ago." Maribel did the math. That was the day before he fell. The day Trina said he was planning to leave. He hadn't just been planning to leave her. He had been planning to rob her. To take everything and leave her with the house, the kids, and an empty bank account. This was not a mistake. This was not a lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, cold-blooded plan. She drove to the rehab facility, a terrifying, silent rage building in her chest. She didn't sign in. She walked straight to his room. He was dozing, his face relaxed in the afternoon light. She stood over him, and her shadow falling on his face made him stir. "Maribel, you're back early," he said, a small, hopeful smile on his lips. "The money is gone, Lowell," she said, her voice calm. Dangerously calm. His smile vanished. What money?" "Our savings. $92,000. You wired it. The day before you fell. The day you were planning to leave me for Trina." "Where is it?" Lowell's face went white. He started to bluster. I don't, it was an investment. A stock." "Don't you lie to me," she roared, and for the first time, he saw the woman from the top of the stairs again. He broke. I gave it to her," he whispered, his eyes squeezing shut. "Trina. She was going to use it to get a new apartment. For us. To start over. It was the final, ultimate betrayal. Not just the affair. Not just the lies. But the theft. He had tried to destroy her, to leave her with nothing." Maribel stared at him, the man trapped in the bed, the man who had pleaded for her help, who had called her a saint. He was a parasite. A liar. A thief. She felt the last thread of connection, the last wisp of duty, snap. The numbness was gone, replaced by a liberating, clean hatred. "You are not my husband," she said, the words falling like chips of ice. "You are just a man in a room." She turned and walked out. "Maribel! Wait! Please! I'm sorry. I'm sorry," his voice rose to a desperate shriek. "Don't leave me. I have nothing. I have no one. Please." She didn't slow down. She walked past the nurse's station, through the automatic doors, and into the parking lot. She got in her car, locked the doors, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Maribel Rivington put her head on the steering wheel and wept. She cried until she couldn't breathe, then she started the engine and drove away, leaving him alone. Maribel drove for hours, with no destination. The highway blurred, a gray ribbon of asphalt pulling her further and further from the rehab center. She drove until the gaslight pinged, and she pulled into a brightly lit, 24-hour truck stop diner. The smell of stale coffee and fried food was a strange comfort. She slid into a worn vinyl booth, her body aching with exhaustion. A waitress poured her a cup of bitter, black coffee. Maribel stared into the cup, watching the steam rise. She could just keep driving. She had her sister, Kala. She had the kids. She could go to Kala's, get a lawyer, file for divorce, and let the state take care of Lowell. It was what he deserved. He had stolen from her. He had planned to abandon her and their children. He had forfeited any right to her compassion, her time, her life. She owed him nothing. The thought was a profound relief, a heavy weight lifting from her shoulders. She picked up her phone and dialed her sister. "Maribel? Where are you? I've been calling." "I left him, Calla," Maribel said, her voice flat. "I'm at a diner. I can't do it anymore." She told her everything. About the empty bank account, the wire transfer, the plan with Trina. She expected Calla to say, "Good. Come home. We'll figure it out." But Calla was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was not soft. It was sharp. "So you're leaving him?" "Yes," Maribel said, relief in her voice. "Good," Calla said. "But I have to ask you one question, and you have to be honest with yourself. Are you leaving him because he's a lying, cheating thief who deserves it? Or are you leaving him because he's in a wheelchair, and this is your first chance to run without looking like a monster?" The question hit Maribel like a physical blow. "What? How can you? He robbed me." "I know. He's a bastard, Maribel. He's garbage. And you have every right to leave him," Calla said, her voice softening slightly. "But I know you. All your life, you've been the one who finishes things. The one who doesn't quit. If you leave him now, in that bed, with nothing, will you be able to live with that? Not for him. For you. I don't want this to be the thing that breaks you." Maribel hung up, the words ringing in her ears. "Will you be able to live with that?" She thought about Lowell, alone in that room, shrieking for her. He was a terrible husband. A failed man. But he was still a human being, and he was completely, utterly helpless. And he was her responsibility, not because of their vows, but because of a shared humanity she couldn't just turn off. Leaving him now felt easy. It felt like running away. And Maribel Rivington did not run. She paid for her coffee, walked back to her car, and sat for a long time in the dark parking lot. She was not the same woman who had cried in her car. She was someone else. Someone harder. She made a decision. Not of love. Not of forgiveness. But of will. She returned to the rehab center. It was 3 a.m. A night nurse let her in, her face full of questions Maribel ignored. She walked into Lowell's room. He had cried himself to sleep, his face blotchy and stained. She stood over the bed, looking at him. He was the man who had ruined her. But she would not let him be the man who defined her. He woke with a start, his eyes flying open, and when he saw her, he let out a choked sob. "Maribel, you came back." "I came back," she said, her voice flat. "But that man you were? He's gone. That life we had? It's over. I'm selling the house. It's the only asset we have left. I'm selling your truck. We're moving into a small, 2-bedroom apartment downtown. The one above the laundromat. It's the only one I can afford that's on the ground floor." His face, which had been flooded with hope, now filled with dread. "We are starting from zero," Maribel said, her voice like steel. "You and me. You will not be my husband. You will be my patient. I will take care of you. And in return, you will do everything I say. You will fight. You will work. You will find a way to pay back the money you stole from your children. This isn't a marriage, Lowell. This is a life sentence. And we are both going to serve it." Months passed, turning the shock of their new reality into a grueling routine. Maribel sold the house, their beautiful suburban home with the gardenias, and watched as another family moved in. The sale barely covered the mountain of medical debt, but it left them with just enough to start over. She sold Lowell's beloved truck. She sold her own jewelry. She held a grim estate sale, watching strangers pick over the remnants of her old life. Their new home was a cramped, ground-floor apartment. The paint was peeling, and the windows looked out onto a brick wall. The constant rumble of the laundromat below was their new soundtrack. Maribel had used the last of their money to make it accessible. There were no carpets, just cheap linoleum. The doorway to the second bedroom, Lowell's room, had been widened. She had a used hospital bed installed and managed to find a second-hand Hoyer lift. Maribel worked full-time at a logistics company, a job she'd found that paid more than her old one. She was up at 5 a.m., getting Lowell cleaned, dressed, and fed, a 2-hour process. She'd transfer him to his power wheelchair, which he could now operate with a new, specialized joystick. A state-funded aide would come for a few hours in the middle of the day, but Maribel did the rest. She'd come home from work, make dinner for the kids at Cala's, then go back to her apartment to get Lowell ready for bed. She was no longer a wife. She was a logistician, a nurse, a provider, and a single mother. She was exhausted, but she was not broken. Lowell, stripped of his charm, his mobility, and his pride, was a different man. The shame had burned away his arrogance. In its place was a quiet, deep remorse. He spent his days in his wheelchair, watching the brick wall, a prisoner of his own body and his own choices. One day, Maribel came home, her shoulders aching, to find Lowell staring at a new laptop on his adjustable table. "Cala brought it," he said, not meeting her eyes. "She said you wouldn't." He had been doing his physical therapy with a grim determination, and he had regained a small, flickering amount of movement in his right wrist and fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He started working. He taught himself how to code, his fingers slowly, painfully tapping at the keys. He took on small, freelance web design jobs, working 16-hour days. He'd be at the computer when Maribel left, and he'd be there when she returned. He never complained. He never asked for anything. He just worked. Every check he earned, he would endorse with a shaky signature and leave it on the kitchen counter for her. Maribel took the money, paid the bills, and never said a word. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the sound of his keyboard and the rumble from below. The kids would visit on weekends, but it was strained. They were scared of this new, quiet father and this hard, tired mother. One evening, 6 months into their new life, Maribel came home later than usual. A project at work had kept her. She was starving and angry, expecting to find Lowell waiting for his dinner. Instead, she was hit with a smell she hadn't smelled in nearly a year, her grandmother's chili recipe. She walked into the tiny kitchen. Lowell was there in his wheelchair, a cutting board balanced precariously on his lap, a pot simmering on the stove. He had chopped onions, clumsily, and opened cans, a feat that must have taken him hours. He turned his chair, his face streaked with sweat and tomato sauce. I know it's not much," he said, his voice quiet. "And I know I have no right. But you looked so tired this morning. I wanted to do something." Maribel stood in the doorway, her work bag heavy on her shoulder. She looked at the mess, at the effort, at the man in the chair who had spent his entire day making her a simple meal. Something inside her, a small, frozen part of her heart, began to crack. She didn't say thank you. She just walked to the cupboard, got 2 bowls, and began to serve. He had put in too much cumin, and the onions were too big. But as she sat at their small, second-hand table and took the first bite, a single, hot tear rolled down her cheek and fell into the bowl. Lowell watched her, his own eyes brimming, but he said nothing. It was the first meal they had shared, truly shared, since the fall. A year passed. Then 2. The cramped apartment became their world. The rumble of the laundromat was just a sound, no longer a reminder of their failure. Lowell's freelance business grew. He was meticulous, and his clients, who knew nothing of his situation, valued his work. He was earning a real income now. He had paid back every cent he had stolen, the money going into a new trust account for Mia and Jareth, an account Maribel alone controlled. Maribel had been promoted at the logistics company. She was a manager now, respected and strong. She had earned her way, her and her alone. The kids were older, more understanding. They would come to the apartment and play video games with their dad, or sit at the table and do homework while Maribel cooked. The atmosphere was no longer strained, it was just life. Lowell was still in the chair. He would never walk again. But he was not the man who had fallen. That man was gone. This man was quiet, patient, and deeply, profoundly kind. He listened to his children. He listened to Maribel, asking about her day, remembering the names of her colleagues, her frustrations, her triumphs. He had become her partner, not in passion, but in practice. One warm summer evening, Maribel came home to find Lowell on their tiny patio, a patch of concrete that looked out onto the alley. He had 2 glasses of lemonade on his lap tray. "Sit," he said, smiling. It was the 2nd anniversary of the day they had moved into the apartment. Maribel sat, taking the glass. The air was warm, and they could hear the distant sound of traffic. "I finished the project for the law firm," he said. "It was the biggest one yet. They offered me a full-time, remote contract." Maribel looked at him, truly looked at him. His hair was grayer, but his eyes were clear. "That's Lowell, that's amazing," she said. And she meant it. She felt a spark of genuine pride for him. "We can move, Maribel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I found a house. A small one, but it's accessible. It has a yard. For the kids." Maribel stared at him, the implications of his words sinking in. They could leave. They could have a home again. You did that?" she whispered. "We did it," he corrected her gently. "I've been saving. It's all in your name. The account. It's enough for a down payment. If you want." Maribel looked at this man, her husband. The man who had betrayed her in the worst way. The man who had fallen. The man who had, inch by painful inch, climbed his way back. Not in body, but in soul. He had rebuilt himself from the wreckage, all for her. He had served his sentence. And in doing so, he had set her free. "He was going to leave you for me," Trina's voice echoed in her memory, a ghost from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was true. He had been. But the man who had wanted to leave was gone. The man in front of her was the one who had stayed. What happened next will impress you, she thought, the title of a story she had been living. She realized the impressive thing wasn't the fall. It wasn't the drama. The impressive thing was this. The quiet work. The rebuilding. The choice to find a new kind of love in the ashes of the old one. She reached across the small table and, for the first time in over 2 years, she placed her hand over his. His skin was warm. His fingers, thin and weak, instinctively tried to curl around hers. "Yes," Maribel said, her voice clear and strong. "I want to. Let's go home." He looked up, his eyes shining with tears he would not let fall. "I love you, Maribel," he whispered, knowing he had no right to expect her to say it back. Maribel smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. "I know you do, Lowell." It wasn't the fiery passion of their youth. It wasn't the blind trust she once had. It was something stronger. Something earned. And as she sat with him, watching the sunset paint the alley wall in shades of orange and purple, she knew, with a quiet certainty, that it was enough. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.